Hi, thanks for being in a new video. I got my hands on the newly introduced Poco F6 and Poco F6 Pro. Let me tell you some main differences between them so you can decide which one to buy. Let's get started. Let me tell you the prices announced for Mexico, although you know that the prices here are not the same as there. Poco F6, in its most basic edition and with the launch promotion, will have a global launch price of $339, while the Poco F6 Pro in its most basic edition and with the promotional price will cost $449 in its global price. So these are very competitive devices with respect to their price, although remember that the prices here are not the same as over there. So this could vary tremendously, but in the description I will also leave you a purchase link in case you want to buy them from AliExpress. So let's start looking at some of the main differences. Something you will notice immediately is that they have a very different design, not only because of the different finish of the back cover, which in the Pro model will be much more stylized because of the gradient and some visual texture, although to the touch it is completely smooth, but it also has a much softer feel, while the base model has a much simpler design. The plastic looks very basic, also the frames will be plastic and it doesn't have any other design highlights. However, the Pro model notes that it has gold-toned camera rings. This camera module has more reflections to give it a more attractive visual touch, but the most attractive from my point of view at design level will be the aluminum frame, which for the first time incorporates little in a device of this series, so this makes it much more resistant against falls. So the Pro model has all these design elements in its favor, giving a much more premium feel. But if you don't care much about the feel in your hand because you're going to put a case on it, you're definitely better off going with the Poco F6 because it's lighter at 179 grams and thinner at 8 millimeters. So if you consider that you're going to put a case on it, that will make both devices thicker and heavier. And if you're going to use a case, you're not going to enjoy the in-hand feel of this Pro device nor the aluminum frame experience. So, in short, if you're going to use a case, it's best to get the Poco F6 because you'll save a little money and you won't feel much difference. But if you want to use your device without a case, definitely that the Pro model gives you a much nicer feeling. In both cases, we see Gorilla Glass Victus to protect the screens, but interestingly, the base model is said to have IP64 splash resistance. While there is no information regarding the Pro model, therefore, there is also another advantage for the base model. Although, let's be honest, the splash resistance I think virtually all smartphones could have because they are not submersible. The screens of these devices were very good in both cases, but there are some very specific differences to highlight. For starters, the Pro model has a bit more resolution going up to 2K, while the base model is down to 1.5K. But I wouldn't really take the resolution into account too much because the difference is not going to be very noticeable at the level of a normal user. So, I wouldn't determine my purchase based on resolution, but I would determine my purchase based on brightness because the Pro model's display achieves a little bit higher brightness, especially when viewing HDR content, which it is at the moment. In fact, it's curious that the base model in this type of HDR content seems to give us a little bit paler colors, while the Pro model gives us a much better definition marked in terms of contrast. And remember that it has a maximum peak of 4000 nits when viewing HDR content. This obviously in specific areas, while the base model stays with the peak of 2400 nits, which is still very good, but definitely the Pro model goes to a much higher level. And you're going to notice that, for example, in the image that they project a more intense brightness. And with that, they achieve a much more realistic result, unlike the base model that is going to offer us more limited brightness peaks. However, if you are not going to display HDR content, they really are very similar screens in terms of quality in specifications. They both reach 120 Hz in their refresh rate, have exactly the same size, and will show good color saturation and good contrast. As I say, the only difference will be when you're viewing HDR content, where the Pro model is really going to come to the fore and its screen dazzles with excellent quality. So, consider that. If you like to watch Netflix, Prime Video or any other streaming content platform that supports HDR content, yes, you are going to really enjoy the experience with the Pro model. But if you're not going to take advantage of the HDR display features, I would really recommend getting the base model because it also has an excellent display and you're not spending as much money. And one last difference in the display, but which is very difficult to show through a video, is the attenuation rate. In the Pro model, it reaches 3840 Hz, while in the base model, we have half that, 1920 Hz. But let me explain what the attenuation rate means because I insist it's not something that we can perceive very easily. The attenuation rate is something that all screens have and that produces a certain level of flicker, which although it is not perceptible to the naked eye, it does fatigue our eyes in a different way. So, in simple terms, we would say that the screen of the Poco F6 Pro is going to tire us less, especially when viewing it in low brightness at night. But that's not to say that the Poco F6 Pro screen is bad. In fact, consider that it has a very high dimming rate compared to other smartphones, so both screens are quite comfortable to view, but the Pro model does rank higher, although you're honestly not going to notice the difference. Unless you are ultra sensitive in your eyesight and you get to feel if one screen fatigues you more than the other, but I honestly don't think so. Better, let's move on to another topic, which is the sound, and in this aspect I must tell you that both devices integrate stereo sound, but the Pro model does have a slightly higher quality sound. I consider that the Poco F6, although it has stereo sound, has some mid-frequencies that come to stand out a little more that make me choose the sound of the Poco F6 Pro, but really both have a very good sound system. So, as you're realizing, the Pro model does have some additional things that could be considered superior, but in most cases I feel that they're not that necessary. So with the Poco F6 you would have a very good experience, but if you want to have an even better experience, the Poco F6 Pro most of the time can give you some additional tidbits. It's worth noting that neither has a headphone jack, and that's an absence that I think is going to weigh on both devices because some competitors are maybe still encouraged to integrate the headphone jack, and I think most of the time Poco's devices are very gaming focused. So as much as wireless headphones try to reduce latency, they don't compare one bit to the immediate response you get with wired headphones. So consider that because you're going to need USB-C headphones if you want to game with headphones on and have an experience without any lag. But now let's move on to the photography section, where I surprisingly like the Poco F6 experience a bit more. The front camera, for example, is 20 megapixels with f2.2 aperture. Finally, we see an evolution with respect to the vast majority of Xiaomi devices that usually integrate a 16 megapixel camera with f2.4 aperture as we find in this Poco F6 Pro. Although, let's be honest, it is not an abysmal difference, but the Poco F6 should give you a slightly higher level photography, especially in low light conditions. And regarding the rear cameras, even though the Poco F6 Pro has 3 cameras and the Poco F6 only has 2, I'd still pick the Poco F6 as well. Let me tell you why. The main cameras on both devices are 50 megapixels, but they use different sensors. In the case of the Poco F6 uses a Sony sensor. Specifically, it is the Sony IMX882. While the Pro model uses an OmniVision sensor called Light Fusion 800, which is a sensor that is equally good quality. But comparing photographs that I have taken very briefly, it seems to me that the Poco F6 takes photographs of higher level, especially when applying a little zoom. I think the Sony sensor is still much more optimized to take better advantage of the digital zoom, so although in specifications they are similar sensors, in the results I like the experience with the Poco F6 more. If your priority is photos, I think this one will give you better results. The ultra-wide camera is very similar in both, and although this Pro model has the macro camera, believe me, it is not going to serve you much. The Poco F6 will give you better quality pictures if you apply a 2x or 4x zoom, and the level of detail will be much higher. It will have better color rendering compared to the macro camera that this device gives you. So do not consider that having 3 cameras is going to be better in photography. In this aspect, I did like the Poco F6 better. And in video recording quality, both are very similar. They reach 4K with 60 frames per second using the main camera. But the difference I noticed is that the Pro model does let you record in HDR with the front camera, although also in full HD. But if you're not going to record videos with the HDR function, you're not really going to notice a difference. So it is a minimal improvement that the Pro model integrates. Obviously, in the software there will be no differences because both devices will integrate HyperOS, so they will have exactly the same features. So let's jump to the battery, where again it is exactly the same capacity of 5000 milliamperes. Although the battery life could also vary depending on how efficient the processor might be, which we'll talk about later, but they're also very similar processors. So really the battery I don't think is going to make a difference, but the charging will, as the Pro model supports 120 watt charging, which Xiaomi promises gets to charge in 19 minutes, while the base model supports 90 watt charging, which is still a very powerful charge. Xiaomi doesn't share a figure on this, so testing will be lacking, but my guess is that it won't exceed 30 minutes. So I don't consider the difference to be that relevant as both have very fast charges. But now let me tell you all about the performance they are capable of. We find in the Pro model the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, while in the base model we have the Snapdragon 8S Gen 3. But pay attention because the nomenclature might get you a little confused. Even though the Snapdragon 8S Gen 3 sounds like it's going to be more advanced than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, it's actually a trimmed down edition, which overall ends up giving pretty much the same performance as the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. So it's curious because even though we find two different processors, we will have very similar performance. Consider also that in both cases we find LPDDR5X RAM and UFS 4.0 storage, so they are practically equal in power. But if you like to rely more on benchmarks, the Poco F6 scored slightly higher in Geekbench 6, reaching 4,743 points in multicore, while the Pro model reached 4,696. I insist that it is a very close score, although in single core it came to distance itself a little more, reaching the power of 1,850 points, while the Pro model stayed at 1,426. So, I insist that the performance is going to be very similar, although in RAM if we see a difference, since the base model of the Poco F6 starts with 8 GB of RAM, while the Pro model goes up to 12 GB of RAM in its most basic edition. And in fact, if you're one of those who want as much as possible, the Poco F6 Pro also has an edition with 16 GB of RAM and a terabyte of storage. It's obviously a bit more expensive, but it's still very attractive. That option isn't available on the Poco F6, so if you're the type that wants the most storage and the most RAM, you can definitely buy the Poco F6 Pro. Possibly this difference in processors will also result in a slight difference in graphics support for some games, but that's something very specific that you have to look at on a game-by-game basis. But if we were to base it simply by age, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 should be more optimized for more content, and surely the Snapdragon 8S Gen 3 will gradually adapt with the latest games with future updates. But the gaming experience, believe me, will be very good on both devices because they also integrate an X-axis optical engine to give a premium vibration response. But if you are specifically interested in a GPU benchmark result on Geekbench using the Vulkan API, the base model achieved a higher score, coming in at 9,927 points, while the Pro model came in at 8,437. So in raw power, it seems that the base model will have more power for gaming, but soon we will make a full review of each of these devices so you can know them in much more detail. For now, it has been a brief comparison that I hope you liked. Remember that I leave in the description the purchase links. See you next time.